Welcome to This Explainer. I'm so excited you're here today because we're diving into what is honestly one of the most fascinating economic mysteries of the entire 20th century. Imagine, if you will, a mid-century global economic powerhouse. We are talking about a nation that, from the end of World War II all the way until the mid-1980s, boasted the second largest economy on the planet. They literally produced more steel, oil, and tractors than anyone else. They achieved nuclear parity with the United States, and of course, they launched the first human into space. But underneath that immense superpower exterior, this colossal system suffered a catastrophic multi-system breakdown that eventually led to a complete and total stall. So, why did the Soviet Union stagnate? Well, today we're going to look really closely at the structural flaws of this rigid machine and conduct a sort of forensic autopsy of a planned economy.
Okay, let's dive right into our diagnostic checklist. We're going to examine 5 failing organs of the Soviet economy. First, the end of rapid growth. Second, planning without prices. Third, the burden of the military. Fourth, the shadow economy. And finally, the oil mirage.
Part 1. The end of rapid growth, the era of stagnation. So this era kicked off in the 1960s and stretched all the way through the 70s and 80s, primarily under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev. And it was characterized by a really profound economic slowdown. I mean, the sheer scale of the plummet is just staggering. The optimism of the 1950s was palpable, right? They had these incredible growth rates of 10 to 15% a year. At that time, Soviet leaders were confidently predicting they would overtake the United States. But then that growth basically just falls off a cliff. It drops to an average of 5% in the 1960s and then plummets all the way down to a mere 1.2% by the early 1980s. The optimism completely evaporated. So, what exactly went wrong here?
Well, to answer that, we can look at a really specific forensic report produced by the RAND Corporation and UCLA, which investigated Soviet economic growth over several decades, and they pinpointed the exact root cause of this decline. It was the total exhaustion of what economists call the Soviet extensive growth strategy.
Now you might be wondering, what is extensive growth? Essentially, it just means growing an economy by throwing massive, continuous infusions of raw resources at it. More labor, more raw materials, more capital investment. And honestly, this strategy actually worked brilliantly in the 1930s and 40s to rapidly build up heavy industry and move peasants into factories. But there's a major catch. Eventually, you just run out of surplus labor and easily accessible resources. To keep growing, an economy absolutely must pivot to intensive growth, which means technological innovation, efficiency, and actually increasing productivity. And the Soviet system? It completely failed to make this transition. Their productivity essentially flatlined because the system just wasn't built for innovation. It was built for sheer volume.
Part 2. Planning without prices. Gosplan's impossible task.
To really understand why they couldn't innovate, we have to understand how they managed their money, or actually scratch that, it's more about how they didn't. This brings us to Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Gosplan was this massive, centralized bureaucracy that attempted something truly staggering. They tried running a modern, immensely complex economy without using market prices. In a normal market economy, prices act as flexible sensors, right? If a price goes up, it signals high demand or low supply, and producers adapt. Gosplan eliminated that mechanism entirely, replacing it with these incredibly rigid top-down output targets.
So instead of prices, they used something called the method of material balances. Planners literally tried to calculate the sum total of the entire nation's resources, establish political priorities, and then manually hand down strict output targets to thousands of economic ministries and enterprises. Some economists later referred to this as profound economic romanticism, or honestly just sheer economic illiteracy. They were trying to manually balance millions of variables every single year without any real-time feedback.
And this rigid command structure had a very profound human impact. In this kind of system, command replaces initiative, and discipline entirely replaces motivation. The sheer volume of decisions facing planners in Moscow just became overwhelming. It created these massive bureaucratic bottlenecks and completely foreclosed the ability of local enterprise managers to flexibly respond to problems, adapt to consumer needs, or invent any new solutions.
Because Gosplan was driven purely by political priorities, it ended up creating this bizarre dual economy. They were highly successful at mobilizing resources for their absolute top priorities, heavy industry. They produced staggering amounts of steel, oil, tractors, and weapons. But they chronically, catastrophically failed at providing for everyday civilian needs. It's wild to think about, but the system could produce the world's largest dams, but it couldn't reliably put meat on the table or provide basic quality consumer goods. And this led to a daily reality of long lines and constant shortages for ordinary citizens.
Part 3. The burden of the military, the arms race's toll.
When a central planner has to choose between civilian needs and huge geopolitical ambitions right in the middle of the Cold War, well, the civilian economy loses, every time. Take a second to just absorb this staggering number, 15 to 17%. By the early 1980s, the Soviet military budget was consuming approximately 15 to 17% of the entire country's gross national product. To put that into perspective, the Soviet Union had an economy roughly half the size of the United States, right? Yet they were dedicating about 3 times more of their economic burden to defense just to maintain that superpower parity.
As researchers of this era impartially point out, this wasn't just a matter of spending a lot of money. This massive military buildup systematically starved the civilian sector of investment and research and development. The military always got the best scientists, the best materials, and the very first pick of resources. This continuous diversion created an absolutely disastrous technological gap between the Soviet civilian economy and the rapidly advancing West.
And because they lacked flexible innovation and uniform standards, the regime actually ordered an end to independent computer development. They literally told their engineers to simply pirate and copy Western IBM/360 designs, which, by the way, they never even had the capacity to build at scale anyway. Or, here's another example. When they tried to build massive domestic gas pipelines, they couldn't even produce the right steel pipe and had to import it. And the best jet engine compressors needed for those civilian pipelines? Oh, those were constantly diverted to the military. Critical civilian infrastructure was perpetually second in line.
Part 4. The shadow economy, systematic falsification.
So what happens on the ground when this rigid, top-down machine inevitably breaks down? Like, how do everyday people actually survive? Well, as economist Noam Chomsky observed all the way back in 1959, because Gosplan demanded strict quota fulfillment and failure meant severe punishment, systematic data fiddling just became a survival mechanism. Bureaucrats at literally every level started falsifying quotas, reporting that targets were met when they absolutely weren't. The central planners in Moscow were making massive decisions based on data that had absolutely nothing in common with reality.
And to actually get things done, citizens and managers relied on something called BLAT. BLAT was this incredibly pervasive, informal network of favors and under-the-table exchanges that operated entirely outside the official plan. It was basically the only way to procure everyday goods and services that the state completely failed to provide. And the rapid growth of this massive second economy further distorted the already totally faulty information Gosplan was using.
On the industrial level, factory managers were using these incredible survival tactics just to keep the lights on. They routinely hid their true production capabilities from the state so their quotas wouldn't be raised. They excessively hoarded raw materials, and they engaged in secret bartering with other factory managers, trading excess steel for lumber completely off the books, just to keep their factories running amidst the chronic systemic shortages.
Part 5. The oil mirage, masking the rot. Now, one of the greatest strengths of the Soviet Union was its vast, virtually untapped Siberian reserves of oil and gas. And they got incredibly lucky in the 1970s. The global oil crises of 1973 and 1979 caused world oil prices to quadruple and then rise again. This turned Soviet oil into a massive hard currency bonanza. But it served as a mirage that completely masked the deep structural rot we just spent all this time discussing.
I think this really evocative quote from Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin to his head of oil production says it all. Things are bad with bread. Give me 3 million tons over the plan. The state had become so deeply inefficient at basic agriculture that it became hopelessly dependent on exporting oil just to earn the hard Western currency needed to buy basic grain and bread from capitalist countries. Think about that. They were literally trading their natural resources just to feed their population and fund their military.
But relying on global commodity prices is a really dangerous game. In the 1980s, the global energy market shifted drastically. Driven by complex geopolitical factors, including, reported urging by the U.S. administration, Saudi Arabia flooded the market with cheap oil. In 1986, global oil prices utterly collapsed. And this was the final catalyst. It instantly drained Soviet foreign currency reserves, completely eliminating the crucial funds they desperately needed for both the arms race and imported food.
As a former CIA chief of staff later described it, this was the equivalent of stepping on their oxygen tube. The sudden removal of that massive financial windfall exposed the completely exhausted, stagnant, and failing command economy underneath. The mirage had finally evaporated. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative question. What happens to a superpower when it runs out of resources and illusions? The stagnation of the Soviet Union wasn't just one bad policy. It was a catastrophic, multi-system failure of a rigid machine that tried to replace human initiative and market realities with command and discipline. It's a truly stark lesson in the absolute limits of centralized control. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it leaves you eager to explore more about the fragile mechanics that run our world. Keep learning, and I will see you next time.